Hello friends, welcome back to EduTap Himachal Pradesh Administrative Services channel. In this session, we are going to continue with LPG reforms that we had left halfway in the past session. And in this session, in the past session, just to give you a recap of what we have discussed in the past session, we discussed what were the events or the scenarios that prompted to the 1991 crisis. We discussed in brief what were the reasons and what was the economic scenario that was prevailing to the leading of the building up of the crisis in the 1991, and we saw that it was a grave crisis. Now in this session we will be talking about how did the government respond to the crisis and come up with these LPG reforms in brief. So let's proceed ahead. Before proceeding ahead, in the last session, I had given you as a homework question that who was the finance minister during 1991 economic reforms, and the answer to that particular question was Manmohan Singh, who was the finance minister during the 1991, and he went on to become the Indian Prime Minister for 10 years from 2004 to 14. So now let's proceed ahead. So what exactly was the response of the Indian government to tackle that crisis? See, the reform process had already started earlier in the late 1980s, which included export incentivization that we had discussed that Indian government had followed a policy of import substitution, and there was no incentive from the Indian government to propel or further the cause of exports. But the export incentivization was followed from the late 7th 5-year plan, and there was a creation of Securities and Exchange Board of India in 1988, and this recognizing the importance of consumer goods vis-a-vis the India's emerging middle class. That is because the Indian middle class was growing and it had a lot growing demands to fulfill these demands. The consumer goods were needed in large amounts. So what exactly did the government do to fulfill that demand? We will be looking at it in the upcoming slides. So the 1991 reforms are the major watershed movement, you could say, that in the India's growth story. Since then India has never seen back, and rest is history. So in this process we will be discussing what exactly were the different reforms measures taken as a part of reforms, and which were liberalization, privatization and globalization. So in this session we will be discussing what are those reforms in brief. So before proceeding ahead, we have to understand few terms, like what do you mean by D Reservation? So D Reservation implies opening up of those industries for the private sector that were exclusively reserved for the government sector. For example, till 1991 there were many industries which were particularly reserved for the government or the public sector. One such example was the telecom sector. Only in till 1991 in Delhi and Mumbai metropolitan cities, MTNL was operating, that is Mahanagar Telecom Nagar Limited. Then in rest of the cities, Department of Telecommunication was providing the telecom services. BSNL, that is Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited, was not operating in the 1991. It came up later on. So this was a government controlled monopoly. So this these sectors were all reserved only for the government sector. But with the D Reservation, now all those sectors, the particular sectors, will be opened up to the private sector as well. So in that particular case, once the telecom sector was de-reserved, then the players like Airtel, Hutch, Idea had come into the sector, which opened up the sector and the competition was infused within the sector. So that was the de-reservation was one of the major policies taken by the Indian government. Then the other policy that was taken was deregulation. So what do we mean by deregulation? Reduction or elimination of government control in a particular industry, usually enacted to create more competition within the industry. So earlier what used to happen was, in the steel industry, cement industry and whatever industry it is, government used to decide what is the amount that has to be produced by the particular industry, and apart from that it used to set the prices at which the industries used to sell those products. Suppose 1 ton of cement, so everything was controlled by the government. Now the government has freed up that the prices will be determined by the market forces, and so that means the deregulation. So it was an act of deregulation. So it means reduction or elimination of government control in a particular industry, usually enacted to create more competition within the industry. So that is deregulation. And there comes the disinvestment. Since we have known that till 1991 most of the government had a control of commanding heights within the economy. Government had a control of commanding heights within the economy. That is, all the sectors were completely controlled by the government. Now government realized that this is not the efficient way to run the economy, so it started up allowing the private sector, and disinvestment was the method followed. So what do we mean by disinvestment? It means sale or liquidation of assets by the government, usually in the central and the state public sector or other fixed asset. We will be talking in this detail in the upcoming slide. Just wanted to make you familiarize with this term disinvestment. So the aim of this exercise is to reduce the fiscal burden on the exchequer, or to raise money for meeting specific needs, such as to bridge the revenue shortfall from other regular sources. So disinvestment is different from privatization. We will be talking in detail and we'll look at the difference. So let us understand the same terms with a example. For example, if in the case of drugs and pharmaceutical industry, government says that drugs and pharmaceutical industry can be manufactured only by a public sector company, then it is a reserved industry. But later on government says that anyone having a license can manufacture drugs and pharmaceuticals in the manner as decided by the government, then it is a D Reservation policy. So now I am just giving you an example that reserved industry was a policy followed till 1991, and post 1991 as a part of LPG reforms many of the sectors were de-reserved. That is, only 3 sectors till date are reserved for the government manufacturing or government providing services. Example being railways, defense equipment, and the atomic power. So only these 3 sectors are reserved completely for the government. Rest all of the sectors have been de-reserved. So that was the motive there. Now we'll understand what is deregulation. Now if continuing with the same example, now if the government says that if anyone wants to manufacture drugs and pharmaceutical, it does not require any license to do so. This is the key point here, and can operate without worrying about restrictions and regulation. This is completely freeing up that sector. That is deregulation. So this will bring the incentivization or further introduce the efficiency within the economy. And apart from that, after some years when government decides to sell its stake in one of its drugs and pharma company, it is called disinvestment. So these are some key terms. Now we will also understand in further during discussion of LPG reforms. So now let's move on. So what exactly is liberalization? This is a policy that has been introduced in the Indian economic reforms and has been continuing since then till date 2021, and it continues to go on further. So what exactly is liberalization? Liberalization means removing restrictions on firms and households to encourage them to participate in economic activities, which was not the case earlier, as we have discussed in the previous session. If you have not seen that particular session, do watch that session and come back to this session, because that forms the bedrock or the foundation for this particular session. So now let us see few of the examples of liberalization. The deregulation of industrial sector, such as let me give you an example, the steel and the cement. In 1991 the production of steel was 6 million tons per year, and in 2021 it is more than 100 million tons. And if you look at the cement, it was 24 million tons back then in 1991, and today it is more than 300 million tons. So this was completely regulated. That is, the production amount was set, limit was set, and the price at which the steel or the cement has to be produced was also set. But now all such restrictions were removed, and the government made it very clear that the prices of the steel and the cement, or the sectors wherever it is deregulated, would be determined by the market forces. Since then 1991, and India has come a far way. Today it is the second largest producer of steel in the world after China. So look at the impact these reforms have had. So industrial licensing was abolished for all but certain products. Like today we need industrial licenses in order to set up the alcohol shops or cigarette hazardous chemicals. So there are only few areas where there is needed. Rest of the sectors have all been de-reserved. So many goods produced by small scale industries have been de-reserved. let us look at this example. See, as a corollary of supply deregulation, what exactly does this mean? Let us go back to the example of telecom sector. Telecom sector in 1991, see, it was completely reserved. That is, it was a government controlled monopoly. Government controlled monopoly. From that we have come to a competitive system. See, in 1991 there were only two companies which were operating, that is MTNL, which used to provide the services in metropolitan cities like Delhi and Mumbai. And in rest of the places it was Department of Telecommunication which used to provide the services. Now if you let me introduce you a term, teledensity. So what exactly is teledensity? So the number of people who own phones per 1,000 people is known as teledensity, and it was in 1991 it was, the number was just 2. So only out of 1,000 people only 2 people were owning phone. And as if you recall, till 2002 or 3, if anyone owning a phone, anyone had owned a phone, that means he was quite well off or rich person. So that was the state. And we have come a far way. Today every person is owning 2 phones. That is as a result of telecom revolution that happened in India. And how did this revolution happen? When the government controlled monopoly was freed up and competition was introduced in the system, where major players like Airtel, Idea and Hutch were allowed to compete in this sector. So since then, as a corollary of supply deregulation, because the supply was regulated, now as it has been deregulated, supply deregulation, markets were allowed to determine the prices of commodity through free market dynamics, and that has helped the Indian economy to a far extent. We can see that example in telecom sector as well as this steel and cement. So this is the essence of this point. And apart from that, let me discuss the last point, which is MRTP Act, which stands for Monopolistic Restrictive Trade Practices Act. So this act was introduced in the year 1969, and the motive or the idea behind introducing this act was so that the economic power is not concentrated in the hands of few monopolies. They wanted to stop the monopolies coming into emergence. So that was the act which was introduced. But what happened was, because of this, any company, if it had crossed a certain limit, then the government started imposing many restrictions. So this sort of policy did not allow this company to grow larger, thereby impeding the growth of an company as well as the growth of an economy as well. So all the companies were incentivized to remain small. So this was hurting the economy to a larger extent, which was replaced with the Competition Act in 2002. So these were all the part of liberalization measures. So LPG reforms is such a huge topic that it needs to be delved in greater details. So in this particular session on YouTube that we are discussing, we are giving a just glimpse of what exactly happens in short summary. So these are few of the major measures that were taken as a part of liberalization measures. Now let's look at the next few of the other measures as in liberalization. So the financial sector reforms were taken again as a part of liberalization. This was on the recommendations of Narasimhan Committee. This is the person Narasimhan who was the who went on to become the governor of RBI in future. In 1991, the finance minister had constituted a committee under Narasimhan Committee, who gave a detailed banking reforms, detailed measures that have to be taken with regard to the banking sector and the financial sector on a large. So what exactly was happened? So as a part of banking regulation, the first and foremost was the competition. Again here the private sector was introduced in the banking sector earlier, which was completely regulated by the RBI and the central government. So it was banking sector was completely controlled by the RBI and the central government, which was freed up by allowing the private sector into it, the free of the competition in 1991, on which was done on the recommendations of Narasimhan Committee. And apart from that, freedom of operation was given to the freedom of operation was given to the banking sector. So what does it mean? It means that now banks can open any bank such as SBI or HDFC. It can open any branches where it wants. Earlier it was not the case. It had to obtain many permissions from the RBI to settle any branch. So this was a controlled sector. And apart from that, deregulation of interest rate. Deregulation of interest rate. So the interest rate that the loan on the loans that were lent by these banks was also decided by RBI, as it was the regulator of the banking sector. So it was deregulated. Now it said that we will just set a floor price. On top of that, you can set any price, any interest. You can charge any interest rate based on your banking operations. So this was a measure, huge measure that was a broad liberal measure that were introduced in the financial sector or the banking sector, and that was with respect to the banking sector. The other measures with respect to the financial sector were debt market reforms, where SEBI was introduced, set up in 1988, and later on it was given the statutory powers in 1992, and it is now currently acting as the regulator of the capital market. And apart from that, foreign institutional investors were allowed in the Indian markets. That is, they could invest in the government securities up to a certain limit. These are the reforms that we are talking, introduced in 1991. In today's scenario, they have been changed to a larger extent. So FIIs were introduced. See, FDI is old as planning. That is, planning measures that we are taking, we have been enforcing since 1951. But FII or FPI is new with regard to the Indian market as a part of liberalization measure. So this was with respect to the debt market reforms that were introduced. So the role of RBI was reduced from regulator to facilitator of the financial sector, and thus paving the way for establishment of private banks and increased foreign investment in the private sector. And the tax reforms were introduced. See, the corporate tax was pretty high. Let me give an example. 97.75% was the excessive tax rate on few of the commodities that was prevailing on few of the commodities back in 1991, and today it has come down to maximum of 30%. And apart from that, there were 11 tax slabs which have been reduced to 3. So what do we mean by this 11 tax slab? This was during the during the independence, and in 1985 to 1986, 1985 to 1 second. In 1985 to 86, VP Singh, who was the finance minister then, has reduced the tax slabs from 8 to 4. What exactly are these tax slabs? Let us discuss them. So this was reduced. This means that the tax slabs that were prevailing in 1985 to 1986, let us discuss them. So there was no tax on the people who were earning income of less than 25,000 per year. Anyone who earns around this is 18,000, pardon me. So anyone who is earning less than 18,000 per year had no income tax to pay, and if it is between 18,000 to 25,000, 18,000 to 25,000, it was 25%. And apart from that, if it is 25,000 to 50,000, it was 30%. And if it is 50,000 to 1 lakh, it is 40%, and greater than 1 lakh, it was 50%. So these were the kind of tax slabs that were prevailing during 1985 to 86. And if you look during the independence, there were 11 tax slabs, and in 1985 to 86 they were reduced from 8 to 4 as a part of that government reforms. And in 1991, the finance minister, that is Manmohan Singh, had reduced them to ultimately 3. So the tax slabs which were prevailing, which has been prevailing since today, even today, is around roughly 3. So, and the taxes keep changing with the every budget that has been rolled out by the government. If you look at the present tax slabs, and for salaried individuals it is kind of different. That is, less than 2.5 lakh, you don't have to pay, 0% is the tax rate. If it is between 2.5 to 5 lakh, and it is further classified as 5 to 7.5, 7.5 to 10, 10 to 12.5, and 12.5 to 15. So this is 25, 20, 15, 10 5%, and greater than 15 lakh it is 30%. So these are the tax slabs that for salaried individual. On rest of the people, for older age income people and for other people, the tax slabs are 3. I just wanted to introduce you to this concept so that you get a fair idea of what exactly are these tax slabs. So these were the major reforms that have been introduced as a part of liberalization reforms. Now let us look at the next one, which is privatization. So before proceeding ahead, see, the government owned company can be converted into a private company through two ways. One is selling a majority stake greater than 51% and the ownership, transferring of the ownership to the private sector. Transferring of ownership to the private sector. This is one way, or the outright sale of the company to a private sector. So this is known as strategic disinvestment. If you are selling greater than 51% and transferring the ownership, it is strategic disinvestment. And if you are outrightly selling the company to a private player, then it is privatization. That is, what exactly does this mean? See, the government owned company is now being converted into a private company. So why is this policy followed by the government? To bring about the financial discipline, and the efficiency within the sector or within the company. See, the private sector is known for its efficiency when it comes to managing the resources very efficiently and generating profits, because there were many public sector units that were undergoing losses during the time of 1991. The government came up with a policy of privatization, where it's slowly it started selling. There is another term, that is minority sale. So if the government is selling less than 50% and it is not transferring the ownership, so the government is selling a part of ownership of the government company to a private player and generating the revenues or getting the money in return for the sale of the stake of that public company. It can all be seen in terms of shareholding. So this is a minority stake. So government slowly started with the minorities sale, then strategic disinvestment and the complete privatization. If you look at the recent example, Air India has been privatized because it was running into losses, and the reason that is believed is all the PSUs are running into losses, not all, most of them, and in order to bring the efficiency within that company, there is a need for the privatization. So now, what were the reforms or measures taken as a part of privatization? We have seen that when the 1991 the sectors were de-reserved, there were only 18 sectors which were reserved for the public sector. Rest of the sectors were de-reserved. Slowly, that number has been reduced to 3 today. But so as a part of 1991. LPG reforms, see, the many industries which were reserved for public sectors had been de-reserved. And if you look at today, only the railways, defense equipment and the atomic power generation is completely reserved with the public sector. And apart from that, so what exactly is disinvestment? So the reforms recognize the importance of policy of disinvestment from transitioning from a controlled and planned economy to a market driven economy. See, I talked about how the government owned company can be converted into a private company through two ways. One is selling greater than 51% of its shareholding, and as well as transferring the ownership or the outright sale of the shareholding to the private company. See, this is privatization. And the strategic sale and the minority sale, where the transfer of ownership is less than 51% and the ownership is still retained with the government. So these minority sale and the strategic sale where greater than 51% is transferred, these both comprise of disinvestment. This is a part of disinvestment, not a part of privatization. So these were the measures that were introduced as a part of privatization. Now let us look at the globalization measures. So the trade and investment policy reforms that were introduced. See, what exactly do we mean by globalization? The integration of Indian economy with the rest of the economies globally. so that if any event or any event occurs or takes place in any of the economies, it will have an impact across the globe. Such is that is known as globalization. So before, the Indian economy was closed economy, that is, we did not allow. When will that happen? When will we become or integrate ourselves with the rest of the economies? When we open up, that is, the trading measures are open for the foreign investors, and all the NRIs can come and deposit. So it has a multiple dimensions. So as we saw in the last session, in before 1991, Indian economy was a closed economy. This is a major measure that Indian economy were opened up. So what exactly we mean by opened up? It has a different connotation. Let us look at them one by one. So trade and investment policy reforms. Following restrictions were removed to encourage foreign trade and the investment. See, we saw that the imports were restricted. They were not allowed within the economy, as the import duty was high. Import duty was high, as well as there were a quantitative restriction, that is, the foreign players cannot import to Indian country greater than certain limit. This is the quantitative restrictions. So we had dismantled the quantitative restrictions on imports alongside reduction of the tariff rates, and apart from that, we allowed the foreign direct investment and FPI to a larger extent. How did this boost? Let me give an example. See, the cement and the steel industry, where foreign sector was introduced, that is, POSCO, a foreign company, had come to invest in the steel sector, which is a South Korean company had come and invested in steel. Because we saw the steel production has increased, this led to the steel and cement. This led to the growth of real estate. This was boosted by steel and cement. So we are seeing that how the growth in one sector will lead to the growth in other sector. So this is how the economy is interrelated. And apart from that, removal of licensing procedures for imports except in case of hazardous and environmentally sensitive products. See, because the government had followed a policy of import substitution, in order to import any product from the other country, there was a necessary for licensing. So this was done away with as a part of globalization measure, and export duties were also progressively decreased to promote exports. And the major reforms that was introduced as a part of foreign exchange reforms were the exchange rate, which was earlier fixed by the RBI, that is, the conversion from $1 to US rupees, which is currently trending around 75. So this is the exchange rate. Earlier this price was fixed by the RBI, but now as a part of LPG reforms, this now is determined by market forces. So this was a major reform that was introduced as a part of foreign exchange reforms. So market has been allowed to determine the forex, and this restrictive FERA Act was replaced with more accommodating Foreign Exchange Management Act, where FDI was not allowed. Now the Foreign Exchange Management Act has provision for allowing of FDI in many of the sectors to a larger extent. So friends, these were the LPG reforms in brief. Because this topic is so wide, we have tried to cover it in as brief as possible. So in the next session, we will be looking at the impact of these LPG reforms on the economy that has happened over the past 30 years, and what are the changes that we are able to witness in today's economy. We will be discussing them. Before winding up this session, there is a homework question for you. So consider the following statement regarding the concept of economic reforms. Economic reforms denote the process in which a government prescribes declining role for state and expanding role for private sector in economy. It is safer to see economic reform as a policy shift in an economy from one to another, or alternative development strategy. So answer this question in the comment section below. We will discuss it in the next session. So before leaving, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please subscribe to our channel for more such interesting videos. So friends, thank you. That's all we have in this particular session.